Guthrie. It is Tuesday. This is actually Nancy's house. This is the closest I've been able to get to the back side of the house, and I'm going to take you really up close in a second. Some interesting things that you can't see from the drone that you can only really see from back here.
There are certain chilling details that remain invisible to a drone, revealing themselves only from this ground-level perspective. On day 59, the investigator reached the edge of Nancy Guthrie's property. He was no longer observing through long-range optics, but was physically embedded in the desert scrub, mere yards from the structure. From this position, the three rear entrances were clearly identifiable. Standing beside him was a veteran homicide detective, retired from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. What that detective highlighted in the initial drone footage, a detail he had noted weeks prior, is a piece of evidence that has completely escaped public scrutiny. His findings provoke a haunting question about the actions of the original search teams, one that remains shrouded in official silence. Today marks day 67 since Nancy Guthrie was abducted from her residence in the affluent Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. 67 days of silence. It has been 67 days since her front porch camera was bypassed in the early hours of February 1st, and 67 days since her pacemaker signal went dark at 2:28 in the morning. That was the exact moment she was pulled beyond the reach of her digital lifeline and into the dead of the desert night. 67 days since her family stepped into a house that appeared completely undisturbed. They found a propped open rear door and bloodstains on the porch, yet there have been no arrests, no persons of interest, and no forensic breakthroughs acknowledged by the state. Currently, the public narrative is being held hostage by the emergence of ransom demands, a series of communications claiming to hold Nancy or possessing knowledge of her condition has been circulating through media channels and digital forums. Savannah Guthrie stated in her initial public address that she believed a small portion of the notes she answered were legitimate. However, she was equally adamant that the vast majority of these messages are cruel hoaxes. Opportunists are manufacturing these contacts, driven by everything from the hope of a reward to a pathological need for relevance. The prevailing theory is that most of these leads are nothing more than noise, yet two specific communications are still being treated as potentially authentic pieces of the puzzle. To this point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has not verified any single message as a confirmed link to Nancy's actual captors. The criteria for such validation are cold and precise: proof of life, details known only to the perpetrator, and a consistent logical thread across multiple points of contact. Not a single one of the publicly leaked notes has officially satisfied those rigorous investigative standards. That void of certainty is where the horror resides. It is the agonizing question of whether a line of communication truly exists, and whether Nancy is still alive to be the subject of it. The struggle to distinguish between a real kidnapper and a digital scavenger testing their luck has drained most of the investigative focus this past week. This fixation is natural, as it addresses the most visceral, emotionally charged aspect of the disappearance. But while that drama unfolded, a critical observation made 8 days ago has sat gathering dust in the public record. It was a revelation shared on day 59 by a man who spent his life analyzing violent crimes within this specific Pima County jurisdiction. He noticed something in the publicly broadcasted footage, a detail hidden in plain sight. Thousands watched those same clips, yet reporters and seasoned analysts alike seemed to miss what this detective saw. It hasn't appeared in a single news report, commentary piece, or online analysis until this very moment. Day 59 was Tuesday, March 31st, 2026, 7 weeks into a case that was beginning to go cold. The investigator remained in Tucson, embedded in the neighborhood long after the national news vans had packed up and left. That morning, he secured a tactical vantage point that had been inaccessible throughout the entire investigation. He was on foot at the rear of the Guthrie property, positioned just beyond the private boundary line. From there, he could finally analyze the physical structure of the home's exterior from a human perspective. He had spent weeks cultivating trust with the local residents to gain this level of access. What he witnessed from that spot, and the subsequent conversation with the retired detective, added a new layer of complexity that no aerial camera could capture. He was finally able to confirm a detail that a source close to the case had previously whispered. That source had explicitly stated that the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home showed no signs of a physical struggle. When investigators first crossed the threshold, they found the house to be remarkably orderly. Certain rooms, according to the source, were maintained in an immaculate condition. The information was precise. There was zero evidence of violence inside the home, and several rooms were described as being in perfect order. The word immaculate is chilling when one considers that an 84-year-old woman was taken by force by what appears to be a highly disciplined team. Pristina interior. This aligns with the testimony Savannah shared in her first public interview, that when her sister Annie and her husband, Tommaso Cion, reached the home on the morning of February 2nd, they struggled to grasp the situation. Everything looked ordinary. Their first thought was that a medical crisis had occurred. They imagined paramedics might have removed Nancy through the rear in the night, as those doors stood open and the house held no answers. A ground-level inspection on day 59 overturned an assumption that Entin and the public had accepted for weeks. He had previously believed, misled by aerial drone photography, that the rear of the residence featured sliding glass panels. Once standing close enough to see the frame, he corrected the record. There are 3 separate doors at the back of the property, none of which are sliding glass. One is positioned under a shaded patio extension, featuring glass panes set into the upper half of the door. A large glass fixture nearby, which many viewers mistook for a sliding door in the footage, is actually a stationary window. The second entrance on the far side of the outdoor area is protected by a mesh screen. Entin was specifically told that the screen door had been propped wide open when Annie and Tommaso arrived, not left slightly unlatched. Beyond the main residence, connected to the far edge of the lot, is the entrance to the casita, the guest house belonging to the estate. 3 separate entry points exist, yet none, according to official statements from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, showed signs of a forced breach. The agency has not confirmed that a break-in occurred anywhere on this site, not the house nor the casita. That silence suggests 2 paths. Perhaps the intruders exploited a lapse Nancy had left, or they had already identified and secured a point of entry during the reconnaissance that preceded February 1st. That surveillance is documented in the records. January 11th has been identified as a significant date, a moment weeks prior to the abduction when a stranger may have been prowling the property. Detectives were reviewing neighbor surveillance footage from multiple January dates. One neighbor shared a detail that has been largely ignored. Their dog was startled awake around 1 a.m. on the night Nancy vanished, staring toward her home and acting in an unprecedented manner. While not forensic, 1 a.m. fits the established timeline. The doorbell camera cut at 1:47 in the morning. A motion trigger followed at 2:12 in the morning. The pacemaker app stopped at 2:28 in the morning. If someone was prowling 40 minutes before the first electronic trigger, a dog fixated on that darkness is a thread that has not been fully investigated. Viewing the terrain behind the home from ground level makes the theory of prior scouting feel much more grounded. Past the fence lies a thick, unforgiving desert filled with scrub, cactus needles, and animal tunnels hidden in the soil, lacking any street lighting. In Dab's view, under a dark moon, it is absolute black. Only an insider could navigate it. Someone who had mapped the terrain, learning where the footing was solid and where it gave way, memorizing the location of the gates relative to the pool and the doors. To an outsider, moving fast through that brush in total darkness while handling a target would be extremely difficult. The lack of reported physical evidence in that desert scrub is a significant clue about the path they took. It implies they used routes they had already mastered. Entin then introduced the expert he had brought along, Kurt Dab, a retired detective from the Pima County Sheriff's Office who spent decades investigating violent crimes in this region. He is not a studio pundit commenting on a case he found online, nor is he providing a distant analysis. He belongs to the same department and knows this specific terrain. His career was built on cases like this in this very community. When he speaks on how the department processes a scene, he does so with a professional authority that is definitive rather than speculative. Dab had never visited the rear of Nancy's home until that morning. He stood there, examining the entryways and the desert brush, and shared an observation about the early drone footage that Entin noted had never been publicly addressed by anyone else. Anon's question was pointedly direct. What stood out in those first drone tapes? Dab anchored the moment to a specific time frame. Early in the investigation, within the first 14 days, the Bureau had already descended upon the property once more. The aerial lens captured their objective. They were systematically dismantling surveillance cameras from the rooftop of the residence. He suspected the pool house was targeted too. Agents were stripping the electronic eyes from both the main house and the secondary structure. Those cameras were not original features. Observations from day 59 suggested these were fresh installations, appearing only after Nancy vanished, visible in the initial drone surveillance. Their removal by the FBI hinted that the silent watchers had already harvested whatever secrets they were meant to keep. While that dismantling was underway, as investigators scoured the exterior, Dabb spotted the forensics unit performing a ritual he knew intimately from his own career. He recognized the clinical choreography of what appeared to be perspective shots. This technique carries heavy weight in law enforcement, and Dabb detailed it with a veteran's cold, calculated precision. A perspective shot ignores the broad landscape. It isn't some detached, overhead view from the heavens. It shuns the wide angle or the artistic, refusing to settle for just any convenient vantage point. Instead, it captures the exact physical coordinates where a human being stood during a critical moment of the incident. It mimics their specific height, their tilt, and the precise path their gaze traveled through the air. During that window, I watched the forensic team document what could only be described as perspective imagery. The photographer mimics the subject's stance to freeze the world exactly as they witnessed it in that fleeting second. It maps the limits of their sight line, defining what was truly visible and what remained hidden. It reconstructs the spatial geometry of the event for the record. The intent is purely, coldly documentary. These frames join the permanent evidence file. They do not interpret or argue, they simply mirror reality. They anchor the physical truth to a verified point in three-dimensional space. This visual proof establishes visibility for a grand jury, long before a single witness provides their testimony. It serves as an unshakable witness in courtrooms and review boards, where human memory often begins to fracture. The primary theater for this technique, as Dabb noted, involves the scrutiny of fatal police-involved shootings. Whenever a service weapon is discharged, the gears of a forensic reconstruction begin to turn on the scene. Teams of photographers and state investigators descend, hunting for the truth within the environment's geometry. The officer must stand precisely where they were when the trigger was pulled, reliving that final, desperate stance. A camera is positioned at their shoulder, documenting the world through the tunnel vision of that exact spot. What sat directly ahead? What occupied the periphery of their frantic visual range? The image confirms if the reported threat was even visible from that specific vantage point. It tests whether the physics of the scene align with the narrative provided by the individual involved. Such photographs form the backbone of administrative inquiries and the critical presentations made to grand juries. They persist through civil litigation and remain etched into the permanent record of any criminal trial that follows. They are immune to debate. They merely reflect the physical reality from a fixed, proven, and documented position. The same clinical logic is applied to the shadows of violent physical assault investigations. In the fog of conflicting stories, where two people claim different ground during a violent confrontation, one victim might claim an ambush, while the subject insists they were positioned elsewhere. Detectives reconstruct these positions, using the lens to verify the lines of sight from each claimed location. Does the reported position hold up against the cold, hard geometry of the environment? Or do blood patterns and footprints suggest a different story? In the visceral world of stabbing cases, where the question is whether a victim had the spatial opportunity to see an attacker coming, or if the angle of entry into a room matches the survivor's testimony. Perspective shots document the architecture of violence with a clarity that physical description alone can never achieve. The legal weight of spatial mapping has been validated in courtrooms, often serving as the final barrier against grave injustice. Consider a specific 1994 case in Queens, New York, a violent shooting that appeared settled. Decades later, a forensic team applied modern trajectory analysis and spatial reconstruction to that same cold scene. Their findings placed the gunman at a vantage point that rendered the original confessions of two incarcerated men physically impossible. Those coerced statements described a sequence of events that the cold, hard laws of physics simply would not allow. Once the scene was accurately rebuilt in 3 dimensions, the bullet paths proved those men were innocent. After 37 years behind bars, their convictions were finally overturned. This wasn't triggered by new witnesses or lost evidence suddenly surfacing from a dusty police locker. It happened because investigators captured documented sightlines and the undeniable reality of the physical environment. That spatial truth shattered the false narrative that had stolen decades of their lives. While human memory and testimony often falter, the cold geometry of a photograph remains objective. Meaningful perspective photography requires surgical precision. Taking a photo from a vague, approximate area holds zero forensic value. The physical evidence must first pin a specific individual to a precise coordinate before documenting that view becomes a legitimate investigative act. The patterns of blood spatter dictate exactly where a body stood the moment violence erupted. A single shoe print in the soil defines a person's path and their exact stance. Analyzing the angle of impact reveals the geometric relationship between the subject and the point of contact. Recorded footage, when its angles are verified, locks a subject into a specific point in time and space. This entire framework of physical reconstruction must exist before a forensic photographer ever clicks their shutter. The lens serves to preserve a position the investigation has already proven, not to search for one. This technical nuance is why the anomalies spotted at the Guthrie estate were so chilling to a seasoned observer. He caught the movement on the screen and realized instantly what he was witnessing. As he analyzed the footage, he recognized the hallmarks of specialized positional reconstruction at work. His gut reaction was one of profound confusion, noting it was bizarre because no shooting had been reported. Throughout his career, he had never seen these specific methods utilized outside of a homicide or a brutal assault. He spoke candidly when questioned, clarifying that these tactics are reserved for officer-involved shootings and high-level violence. That is the threshold for such precision. He was careful, however, not to overstate his findings. Usually, he explained, you only see this when there is a firearm involved, or, perhaps, a stabbing or a similarly violent encounter. That is when these forensic protocols are triggered. He did provide two other potential theories for the activity, starting with simple height calibration. It's possible those rooftop cameras were merely gathering geometric data to map the property from an elevated perspective. The second possibility was an analysis of sightlines from various entry points. If an intruder scaled the wall, what would be within their field of vision? Both are plausible. Yet, neither has any place in a routine search for a missing person. Precise height mapping and visual field analysis are the technical dialects of a crime scene rebuild, used only when investigators have a firm theory on how a person navigated a space and are ready to memorialize that theory. We must also recognize the individual who made this entire investigative conversation a reality, spending 8 grueling weeks on the ground while the rest of the media cycle moved on. Brian piloted the drones and traversed the difficult terrain himself to find the truth. He cultivated deep-seated trust with sources and brought high-level experts directly to the scene. He remained a constant presence in that quiet Tucson neighborhood long after the official press conferences had fallen silent. Because he was still there on day 59, lingering in the shadows of the brush behind the property, and still engaging with a veteran Pima County detective, these critical observations finally reached the public. That level of investigative grit deserves a moment of genuine recognition. If his dedication to uncovering the truth has resonated with you, please leave a thank you in the comments. Only a handful of journalists are investigating this, and fewer still are applying this level of forensic scrutiny. Before we analyze how those perspective photographs substantiate the theory of a staged crime scene, ensure you are following the feed. This inquiry frequently unearths subtle details that emerge in silence, only to completely dismantle your previous perception of the truth. Our collective analysis has repeatedly outpaced formal statements, a crucial distinction given how meticulously the official press briefings have been curated. Consider this. What is the significance of detectives performing such granular forensic mapping at Nancy Guthrie's residence, less than 14 days into the search? The comprehensive timeline of events within those walls aligns perfectly with these documented visual angles. Both data points reinforce a singular, chilling architecture of what likely transpired during those dark hours. The sheer logistical complexity suggests a team of between 2 and 4 individuals was necessary to execute the plan. Extracting an 84-year-old woman from her home in the dead of night without alerting a single neighbor is a haunting feat. To do so without leaving behind a shred of physical evidence inside the dwelling or appearing on any security feed during her removal demands a level of synchronization impossible for a lone actor to achieve. That bag brought to the house at 2 o'clock in the morning was never intended for a simple burglary. It has been identified for its true purpose, a specialized abduction kit, pre-assembled and tailored for a singular, high-value target. Such meticulous foresight indicates that the groundwork was laid long before anyone crossed the property line on the night of February 1st. The hypothesized sequence of events unfolds like this. A phantom presence was already lying in wait when Nancy arrived home from her dinner engagement on the evening of January 31st. This intruder neutralized her within the house, which explains the unsettling lack of any signs of a struggle in the living quarters. A clinical extraction performed by someone familiar with the floor plan leaves none of the frantic disarray typically seen in a spontaneous, violent encounter. Every object remained undisturbed because the intruder's path through the home had been calculated with surgical precision. Meanwhile, an accomplice took their post at the entrance. Nancy, still capable of walking, was directed toward the exit. It was at the front steps, seeing the open street and realizing this was her final opportunity for escape, that the dynamic shifted. She fought back, and it was in that instant that blood was spilled. The interpretation of the crimson patterns is vital. The droplets descended in a perfectly vertical line. There was no sideways momentum, no horizontal spray across the concrete or the stairs, no smears suggesting she was moving while bleeding, and no high-velocity misting from an arterial strike. The blood pooled exactly beneath the victim. This is the forensic hallmark of an injury to the head or nose sustained while a person is standing perfectly still. Gravity pulled the fluid directly from the impact point, creating a localized pool without any outward dispersal. This does not reflect a prolonged physical altercation or the telltale signs of a body being moved across the ground. Instead, it indicates a solitary, concentrated burst of violence at a specific coordinate. A figure at the door, a sudden blow, blood descending vertically, and then a quick exit into the waiting shadows toward a vehicle. Surveillance footage from the area shows no sign of a vehicle in the driveway or parked in the immediate vicinity, implying that whoever drove Nancy away had stationed their transport further down the street, perhaps around a corner close enough for a rapid exit once she was clear of the gate, but distant enough to vanish from the reach of neighboring cameras. If a third accomplice was indeed behind the wheel of a waiting car, the baseline cell would consist of 2 operatives inside the residence and a third stationed down the block. This tactical arrangement is the only one that satisfies the complex logistics of such a seamless disappearance. We are looking at 3 people executing a synchronized abduction in a quiet suburb before dawn, each with a predetermined role, a scouted path, and a vehicle positioned for a swift departure. Now, overlay the forensic perspective photographs onto this timeline. The sight of technicians positioning themselves at precise points across the grounds and capturing specific visual fields suggests they used physical traces to map exactly where a predator stood during that violent moment at the door. This involves verifying the exact spot where the masked figure from the doorbell footage stood, cross-referencing that angle with the precise location of the blood droplets. They might also be mapping the movements of the person believed to have been hiding inside the residence, a ghost who moved through the house and directed Nancy toward the front without leaving a footprint. Alternatively, they were examining the rear access point, documenting the line of sight from the screen door to the interior to see exactly what the intruder saw as they crossed the threshold. Every single scenario remains plausible. Each hinges on investigators having built a physical model precise enough to pinpoint very specific locations. None of these maneuvers belong to a standard protocol for a missing person search. These early investigative lapses are critical because they define the void between what the scene held and what was documented. A source confirmed that the team dispatched for the initial response lacked any veteran homicide detectives. The individual overseeing those first critical hours had, according to that witness, never led a murder investigation before taking charge of the entire homicide unit. Former Puma County Sheriff Dr. Richard Carmona, who was once the United States Surgeon General, stated publicly that the sheriff made a scene release choice the lead detective should have made. Carmona's critique was blunt. The scene was compromised by that premature abandonment. Retired federal agent Steve Moore noted that had the Bureau been on site from hour 1, investigators would have seized tiles from the entrance for high-velocity blood pattern analysis, a process that extracts trajectory data from beneath visible stains. Such data is permanently lost once the surface has been disturbed by foot traffic. That analysis never happened, yet federal agents returned within the first 14 days, as the footage confirms. They were observed dismantling and removing surveillance equipment from the roof. While there, forensic photographers documented the property in a way consistent with violent reconstruction, targeting specific angles. They were capturing views at a home where officially no gunfire, stabbing, or assault had been recorded. No documented struggle, only a missing person, yet the forensic protocol used is reserved for violent crime reconstruction. The analyst also highlighted sophisticated tools likely deployed on a scale the public reports have not mentioned. He specifically referenced geofencing, a technique that creates a digital perimeter around an area to identify every active mobile signal during a specific window. Applying that to a 2-mile radius around the neighborhood during the timeline should identify any active phone in the vicinity. Essentially, you place a digital net over a mile or two to track every cell phone used then. The fact that no one has been publicly linked to the scene through that specific method, if it was used, suggests it was either skipped or it produced results aligning with the jammer theory circulating in the community. A cellular jammer can be acquired legally to suppress all signal activity within a limited radius. If one was active near that house on February 1st, the tracking data would show a digital hold during the event. This is a complex detail the investigator raised as a possibility, rather than a confirmed fact. But in the context of such a calculated crime, that possibility is far from being trivial. 67 days later, there are 0 arrests, 1,000 tips reviewed, a $1 million reward that remains unclaimed. The investigator addressed the haunting silence surrounding that reward directly. He theorized that the mastermind behind this operation understood from the start that participants represent the primary risk. Someone capable of planning a crime at this level and maintaining total security for over 2 months might decide that the people who could talk are the people who should no longer be available. He noted he has seen that ruthless logic play out in past murder cases. The first person caught is usually the first to talk, and those still free know it. Whether that fear explains the silence, or if participants are physically unable to come forward rather than unwilling, is something only the case file can answer. The expert's perspective has evolved, and by day 59, he stated this operation was either the work of professional training or of incredible luck. His current view is that it is likely a combination of both, marking a slight shift in stance. He initially thought the masked figures fumbling with a backpack and their awkward movements suggested a lack of experience. They were either absolute professionals or they were just incredibly, statistically lucky. Right now, I believe we are looking at a mixture of those two things. 2 months on with no resolution, the successful execution suggests a level of capability that the clumsy video footage does not reflect. Truly inept individuals do not maintain such high-level operational discipline for this length of time. This entire operation suggests deep preparation, even when the outward behavior appeared entirely amateurish. What facts are verifiable? Dabb's observations on day 59 confirm a shift. By week 2, investigators were no longer treating this as a disappearance. They were mapping a violent crime scene. Officers were standing at precise coordinates, reenacting the crime from specific perspectives dictated by the blood and physical evidence recovered. That visual archive exists. The files contain views from the blood-spattered threshold and the sightlines from every potential entry point. The property's geometry tracks someone's path through the darkness on February 1st. All recorded, all kept hidden. The debate over the ransom note will endure until the question of its authenticity is finally answered. That skepticism is warranted, but the forensic perspective established in those first 2 weeks offers a record that predates the public narrative. It represents the investigator's private reconstruction rather than the sanitized version shared with the press. What exactly were those perspective shots trying to capture? A figure at the door, an entrance at the back, or a deeper detail revealed only by the evidence? Share your forensic analysis below. If Brian Entin's presence in Tucson, still at that house 8 weeks later, resonated with you, leave a note of appreciation for him in the comments. That level of commitment is rare. Subscribe to stay informed as this investigation continues to unfold. In a case where the official narrative is so meticulously guarded, the most critical details often emerge suddenly and change the entire scope of the mystery.